Hey everyone, this is Bo. In this video, I set out to build this entryway table. It is 73 inches long, 32 inches high, and 19 inches deep. It has 3 full extension drawers and has a lower shelf for storing larger baskets. So stay tuned for all the build details and how this went together. And as always, thanks for watching. Alright, so I have all my lumber here. Purchased it last night from the home improvement store. And what you can see, I got a big, looks like a big mess, stack of things. I have some oak hardwood on top. I then have 3/4 inch oak plywood. I bought 2 sheets of that. And then I have 1 sheet of 1/2 inch birch plywood. The birch plywood will be used for the drawer boxes. The 3/4 inch oak plywood will be used for the rest of the structure, all the sides, legs, tops, dividers, and then the hardwood's going to be used for edging, to cover up the plywood edge, and then as well as going to be used for the false drawer front. I also behind me here have a leftover, or I shouldn't say leftover, but an old piece of quarter inch plywood that I'm going to be using for the back. I do ask that when I purchase this at the store that they do help me cut it down into more manageable pieces. For transportation, I have a car, so I need it to be able to fit into the trunk of the car and kind of I can fold the back seats down and slide it through there. And as well, once I get it in here, then I don't need to take up a whole bunch of floor space, cross-cutting pieces and doing whatnot. So I'm all set. I have to sort through this stack of lumber, and then I'm going to start cutting the hardwood for edge banding. So, go get them. I'm going to go get them. I'm going to do stuff. Yeah, I'm going to do stuff. Yeah, that's it. That's it.
Alright, I'm going to start doing my rough layout here so I don't make any mistakes on the pieces. Speaking of mistakes, make sure to stay tuned to the end to see all the outtakes from this. Moving on to cutting the oak. First I'm cutting the false fronts and marking them A, B, C just so I know which orientation and direction they go in to keep that grain continuous. Now moving on to rough cutting the trim pieces. And before I start to cut down the edging, I'm jointing one edge before I run it against the bandsaw fence. Alright, the first cut on the bandsaw here, I'm actually ripping all the pieces to their width. And then after that, I flip them on edge and now I'm resawing them to the thickness. And here's one of the really long pieces for the top and mid shelf. Now I'm moving on to planing all the edging to thickness. Always a good time with these long, flexible pieces. Never staying where you put them, always falling over. Oh, look at that. Dustbin's full. If anybody has a more clever way to not get the bag vacuum locked on there, let me know in the comments. Instead of ripping all of these on the table saw, I'm passing them through the planer here to get them to my desired width. Probably should have done this before I resawed them, but it's alright.
Alright, so I've gotten all the edging cut to size, and then resawn, planed, flipped, planed again. At this stage, the edging is it's between an 1/8 and a 1/16 larger than it needs to be to cover the plywood edge. Leave me enough allowance to glue, nail, and then trim off the excess when I get to that point. Next up is going to be cutting all the plywood pieces to width on the table saw. Or I shouldn't say width. I'm cutting them all to the depth of the table. That overall depth is going to be 19 inches deep, but each side of the plywood panel is going to have a piece of edging, so I have to subtract off 9/16 of an inch. So yeah, so what I'll be doing is I will rip one edge on the table saw to clean it up, and then I'll flip it around, put that edge against the fence, and move my fence to the appropriate width and cut to its final size at that time, just so I have two nice clean edges to work with. So I have to cut the sides, the lower shelf, the top, the mid shelf, the center divider leg, and then the individual shelf dividers. All of them will be the same exact width, so I'll be cutting quite a few pieces here, all the same size, which will make things pretty quick. All right, let's go.
All right, just taking it slow and steady here, cutting this wide panel to size, and now moving on to the longer pieces. Next up is cutting these pieces to length. I first started on the track saw, and you can see I got both pieces stacked on top of each other and clamped together. I then remembered that I had a miter saw that had quite a bit of crosscut capacity, so I moved over to that.
So I have all the structural pieces of the table cut to their final dimension, except for a few pieces that have to fit into joinery, and I don't want to cut them to their final dimension yet until that joinery is cut and I know everything's perfectly sized. So the two sides, the top, the mid shelf, those have been cut to final dimension because I know where those are going to be. The shelf dividers have been cut to their final depth of the table so they can get edged, but their final height has not been cut yet. I'll do that after I cut the joinery. Same with this, the same with the vertical divider. It's been cut to its depth of the table, but not its overall height because I got to cut the joinery first. And the same with the lower shelves. Those have been cut to their depth, but not to the final length because they're going to sit in dados and I want to cut those. So yeah, time to add hardwood edging. I'm doing this before I assemble the table due to the fact that I'm going to pre-finish this piece as well. So due to pre-finishing, I want to have the hardwood edge on there and finish that at the same time. Now that I'm saying it out loud, I may not have to do that. Let's see. Yeah, I'm still going to. Screw it. Yeah, I'm still going to attach the hardwood edging to it first. I usually don't do it that way, but I'm going to give it a shot. So here we go.
All right, edging all these plywood pieces. Looks kind of like this. Cut the hardwood to size. Put glue on both pieces, or one of the pieces. Nail it in place. Fill the nail holes. Then move on to the next piece. By the time I get done edging all the pieces, the first piece is dry, as you can imagine, so I come back here, sand off some of the filler, and then use my router to flush up the edging.
All right, so all the plywood for the table has been edged. All that edging has been trim flush, which did take a while, like 2 hours. Took a while to do all that, but it's done. And now I'm ready to start cutting the joinery. So I have a combination of dados and rabbets to cut. I'm going to start by cutting the rabbet. Before I cut the rabbet though, I did set my blade up for the appropriate dado width on a sample board here. I like using this certain type of plywood because it actually is dimensionally correct. So 3/4 inch dado stack usually works just right. So I got that dialed in the right dado width to match the plywood. So I'll cut my rabbets first, remove the rabbiting fence, and then start cutting my dados. And then at the end of that, we should kind of have the thing that resembles a table, which is going to be cool. So yeah, back to work.
Initially here, I have to choose what face is going to be the outside and what side is going to be the top before I start cutting my joinery. Dial my fence into my mark and cut the dado.
So I've cut the rabbets and the dado in the side panels, and then these panels will fit, you know, here, and the other one will then go in the dado or in the rabbet on top. And so now I have to cut the dados in the top and the middle shelf to accept the drawer dividers. And so I'm calculating where those need to be, so I end up with 3 equal compartments, just so then down the road I can make all the drawers the same size, and everything is a little bit more efficient that way. Okay. And so I'm going to cut it. I've never tried this before, but I'm going to use my little utility sled here with a fence that's perpendicular to the edge. I'm then going to clamp these to the sled and push it through, and hopefully it all works out.
So first thing to note here is there is a stop block attached to my rip fence, and so I'm using that to set the distance before I clamp the piece to my sled. Just checking square, making sure it's working as I intended. So bump it up to the stop block, clamp it down, run across the dado stack. Now I'm cutting the dados in the center divider, and I'll be cutting them in the outer panels here in a minute. These were a different depth than the rest of them. These were only a 1/4 inch deep instead of 3/8 deep.
All right, so magically I've got the table dry fit. A few things I didn't record. One, I was trying to figure out how to put it together, and so I started messing around with that and forgot to turn the camera back on. But it was mostly 45 minutes of me dicking around trying to figure out what I was going to do. Eventually, though, I was able to figure out I could lay this end down the ground. I then put in this mid shelf and clamped it with a little 90-degree leg thing here. I could then set the other side on top of it, so it was this high, set it on top, and I could use some of these little corner clamps, hold it in place as I picked it up and lifted it and set it on its feet. I then lifted it up on the bench, so I had it elevated. And then I knew the size of the drawer dividers already, so I had those cut and put them in place, and then I could set the top on. And so the top was basically done at that point in time. The bottom was a little bit more involved. First, I had to measure and cut the center divider here, or the center leg. And I got that cut and fit into place. So the last step then was to measure and cut the lower shelf pieces. I measured them, cut them on the miter saw. And now I'm going through and taking measurements of everything, making sure everything's square, everything's fitting up the way I'd hoped. And so 2 things I did here. I measured all the drawer openings. So I was shooting for them to all be the same. Unfortunately, I'm off a little bit. I got 23 3/8 for the left one and the right one, the width. And the center one's only 23 5/16. So I have a 5/16 inch difference, meaning that my setup was off by a 30-second. So a 30-second on this side, a 30-second on that side, left me with a 16th difference. So whatever, I'll make the drawers accommodate. As well, I was taking some dimensions side to side, and I noticed that the bottom of this table is an 1/8 inch wider than the top. And I think that's due to the fact that these shelves are probably just a little bit too long, so I'm gonna cut a 1/16 off each one of those, and that should bring then the table back into square. Coming up here, I'm gonna be cutting these down to size. I'm gonna be cutting out all the parts for the drawer. I'll be dialing in the false fronts of the drawer as well. And then after that, it's going to be a lot of sanding. I need to cut the rabbet in the back of the table for the back. The back is just going to be in this part here, these two openings, just to give the table a little more rigidity, and as well as keep stuff from sliding off the back and getting maybe lost between this and the baseboard. So, yep, back to it. Not sure why I've been holding this the whole time. Uses my wooden laser pointer.
Since this material is only 1/2 inch thick, I decided just to use the old glue and blue painter's tape trick to hold this edging on, instead of risking a nail blowout.
Alright, so I'm on to the drawer components here of the table build. And the next step is to flush up the edging on this plywood pieces. On the larger pieces, I was using a palm router with a flush trim bit and my lipping attachment. That was time consuming and awfully messy and noisy. So there's got to be a better solution, especially for pieces that are small like this, where I can take the piece to the tool. So what I've put together here is just a little U-shaped fence, and this auxiliary fence here is flush with the outside of the table saw blade, but it's up off the table, so the edging fits underneath it, and so I can pass this piece through and actually cut the edging instead of routing it. I've done a couple test pieces, dialed in the fence location, so it's cutting it flush, but not actually cutting into the plywood piece. So now it's time to cut the bottom groove in the drawers. I already cut the rabbets in what's going to be the left side and right side of the drawers. So now all the drawers will need a groove for a 1/2 inch bottom. I have a 3/8 inch bit in the router right now. The 1/2 inch bit I have is a little oversized for this plywood. So I'm going to be taking one pass, and then I'll be bumping the fence over to sneak up on that fit for the 1/2 inch plywood bottom. So here we go. So after cutting the grooves for the bottom, I then focused on cutting the front and back pieces to their final length. And so using the dimensions I took from my dry fit, I was able to take the drawer sides themselves, measure the thickness left on the drawers after cutting the rabbet. That's going to subtract from the opening minus the 1 inch for the slides. So that's how long your front and back have to be. And so that's why I do like this drawer. The word I'm looking for is joinery, the drawer joinery, because you can cut your rabbets first and then cut your final, your critical dimension piece on these drawers is side to side, because that's what's got to fit perfectly in between the slides. So I was able to sneak up on this fit, get it just right using my measurements. Then after I cut all these, I realized that, oh, hey, I could do an actual dry fit of the drawer in the opening, because I had the mid shelf here and these drawer dividers. So luckily everything still fit nicely. I took some accurate measurements the first time, so it all worked out. Now it's on to cutting the bottoms for the drawer. They will be out of 1/2 inch plywood. And I took some measurements of what those should be. And then I'm also going to cut the bottom groove off for the back piece, so I can slide the bottoms in after I assemble them and screw them in place. Yeah, that's my story.
Alright, moving on to the bottoms here. Just like all the other pieces of plywood, do one rough cut and then bump the fence over, do your final dimension cut. And now I'm using my sled here to cut the perpendicular edges. And then finally I'm ripping off the bottom section of the rear drawer piece so the bottom can screw into it. It was at this stage that I did a bunch of sanding, starting with 80 grit and going just to 120 since it's a painted project.
So I've just got done masking off all of the areas that are going to be either inserted into a rabbet or a dado, so I don't get the finish in that area, because I'm going to, of course, glue it up afterwards. So I've masked off all the pieces, kind of with just masking tape here, and I've got some pieces behind the camera over here laid out around the shop because I'm going to start painting these. The paint I'm using, first time trying this. I haven't used milk paint before, but I've heard and read good things. And I've also done a test piece that I was happy with how it looked on the oak. Still lets a little bit of the grain through, but leaves a very smooth finish as well. So I was happy. This was 2 coats with the sand in the middle, both applied with a brush. So even with the brush, it turned out pretty nice. So I plan on actually applying this with a roller today, since everything's large and flat. And hopefully it coats enough. I don't know. We'll see. It's the color, if you didn't see before, is dark chocolate, which is kind of that black-brown color that is scared about our house currently. So I guess without further ado, we'll go ahead and get painting here. Got quite a bit of wood to cover.
And here we go, just using a roller. I think in this instance I'm using like a Wizzy velour roller. I also used a 1/4 inch nap roller and didn't really see a difference. And I'm just painting the pieces, and I have my drying rack off to the side here. After a few hours, that paint's dry, and I come back with 320 grit sandpaper, give it a light scuff, vacuum up the dust, and then give it a quick wipe down with some water, and it's ready for its second coat. After that second coat has dried, now it's time to move on to poly, and so I'm using some water-based polyurethane here. Once again, just rolling it on, moving it to my drying rack, and moving on to the next piece. And now on to the ever-pleasing tape removal. During the actual glue up, I modified my process a bit versus the dry fit. I thought it'd be easier to stand the top and mid shelf up together with the drawer dividers already glued in place. So here I'm gluing the top to the 2 drawer dividers and to the mid shelf and getting that clamped up. Alright, after about 15 minutes, some coffee, and some courage building, I moved on to the big glue up here, starting with the side piece down on the ground on some 2x4s so I can get access for clamps. And then I moved that sub-assembly on top of it, clamped that into place, and moved the other end panel into location, got that clamped up. And here I probably did this in the wrong order. I should have done the bottom, what would be the bottom mid shelf here. Should have done this piece first, then done the center, and then done the top. But it all worked out. And then lots of clamps, checking for square, reorienting clamps a little bit to push and pull panels which way I need them to go. After about a day in the clamps, it was time to get this thing into its normal orientation so I could continue the finishing process. So after the glue up, there were some little gaps or holes I had to fill. So I do not show, but I do touch up all the corners with this small little artist paintbrush. Where I masked the pieces and pre-finished them, there may have been just a really small strip of unpainted wood where the joint didn't exactly line up with where I masked to. So I used this small brush just to get in the corners and cover that up. Now it's time to paint the sides and the top. I got the front and back painted, the edging here, so now it's time to move on to top and sides, and it's getting its second and final coat. Alright, since the paint is drying, I'm moving on to the drawer assembly. All these parts have already been sanded and polyurethaned, and I found it easier to actually start by attaching the pieces to the bottom, flipping it over, getting the bottom squared up and getting those joints tight, drive screws in through the bottom into the back, flip the drawer over, and clamp everything together so that the top joints were nice and tight. After that dried up, I wanted to add some dowels to reinforce those rabbets, so here I'm laying out a location for 2 dowels per joint, where I drill a 1/4 inch hole for the dowel. So I applied some glue to the dowels, inserted them, let them dry for maybe half an hour, come back and flush trim them here with my flush trim saw. And now it's time to polyurethane the top and the sides. I can't remember if this is my first or second coat here in this video, but both coats were applied the same way with a roller. If this is my second coat, I scuffed it with 320 in between coats. Once that polyurethane is dried, I now move on to installing the drawer slides into the cabinet or into the table. So I have a little spacer there, and that's what I'm using to set the height of each slide. And I have a mark on the cabinet to set how far into the cabinet it needs to be. These are inset drawer fronts, so they do need to be set quite a bit further into the cabinet. And then to attach the drawer to the slide, I have small 1/4 inch spacers under the drawer bottom to keep it off the bottom of the table, and then I'm just moving hole by hole, attaching it. After a total of 3 coats of polyurethane on the top and the lower shelves, I apply a little bit of wax, and I come back and I buff that wax off after it's dry, just to give a little bit added protection and a little bit of sheen and feel. So the false fronts, I pre-drilled the holes for the hardware, and I actually use those holes to hold the false fronts onto the drawer once I get them appropriately spaced from the table. And now I'm coming back and drilling holes for the fronts to attach that, and then drilling through the drawer to attach the hardware. Sorry for the somewhat rushed explanation here, but this video is getting awfully long. Here's some finished pictures of the table in its final location. I brought it inside and nailed the back into place. You can see the drawers here, what they look like pulled out. Overall, it turned out really nice, and I appreciate you all spending the time to watch this video. So for your entertainment, here comes some of the outtakes from filming. There's got to be a better solution. What am I talking about here? All right. Oh, all right. Let's see. Where the hell's my coffee? What? Okay.
What? Um, oh, hopefully any of those versions were okay. Probably not. Damn it. Alright, try it again. That was pretty good.